Hi guys, my name is Melaka Jude and I'm back with the second part on the lesson series on the skeletal system done by the Gampa Medical Student Association. As usual, if you found our videos interesting and useful, please do not forget to hit that like button, subscribe and continue to follow our GAMSA RP YouTube channel for more national A-level bio lessons. So in today's video, we'll be talking about basically the axial skeleton and the appendicular skeleton and all the bones and joints related to it, and especially how each skeleton has undergone adaptations in order to contribute for the normal body functioning of the human body. So to start off, again, the human skeleton consists of two parts, which is called the axial skeleton, which is further divided into the skull, the vertebral column, the sternum and the ribs, and also the appendicular skeleton, which is further divided into girdles, both pectoral and pelvic girdle, and also limb bones. So starting off with the axial skeleton, the skull. The skull rests on the upper end of the vertebral column and consists of 21 bones, which are mostly connected together by ossified joints known as sutures. These sutures are immovable joints which are present between the skull to provide more protection to the brain and other structures present underneath the skull. The skull is generally divided into two parts, the cranium, which is called the brain case, and the face. So there are 8 bones which make up the cranium: the frontal bone, 2 parietal bones, the occipital bone, 2 temporal bones, the ethmoid bone, and also the sphenoid bone. And these bones can be seen in this diagram. Whereas here, this is the parietal bone, which is present on either side of the cranium. There is a temporal bone, which again is present on either side of the cranium. There is the frontal bone. There is an occipital bone, and also the sphenoid and ethmoid bones both make up parts of the eye socket in the cranium. The face is made up of 13 bones. So 2 zygomatic bones, which are the cheek bones, the maxilla, which is the upper jaw bone, 2 nasal bones, 2 lacrimal bones, the vomer, 2 palatine bones, 2 inferior concave, and also the mandible, which is the lower jaw bone. And these bones again can be seen in this diagram. So you have the mandible, the maxilla, the zygomatic, which is the cheekbone, the nasal bone, which makes up the outer part of your nose, and also the lacrimal bone. Whereas the other bones you can't necessarily see in this diagram because they are present more towards the inside of the skull. So let's talk about the cranium and a few facts about it, right? So the human cranial capacity is about 1.5 liters, and the cranium protects and encloses the brain, the inner ear, the middle ear, olfactory organs, and also the eyes. So bony sockets, which are made out of bones belonging to both the face and the cranium, provide attachment to the eye muscles that move the eyes. There is a cavity on the inferior side of the cranium called the foramen magnum, which provides passage to the spinal cords. 2 smooth rounded knobs, which are called the occipital condyles, are present on either side of this foramen magnum, and they articulate with the first vertebrae, which is called the atlas vertebrae, and thus permit nodding movements. In the cranium, there are soft membranous regions called fontanelles, which allow slight compressions at birth, thus facilitating parturition. So due to the contractions of the womb during the birthing process, the head of the fetus is slightly compressed, and thus fontanelles, being soft and membranous, allow for this slight compression and thus aid in the birthing process. Fontanelles are generally repressed by bones within the first 2 years of a human's life. There are several air-filled cavities which are lined by ciliated mucous membranes, and these are present in the skull, namely in the sphenoid, the ethmoid, maxillary, and the frontal bones. and these airfill cavities are called sinuses. The main function of sinuses is to communicate with the nasal cavity, provide resonance to voice, and also reduce the weight of the skull to be able to be borne by the rest of the axial skeleton. Let's talk about the joints of the skull. So some facial bones of the skull form the walls of the posterior part of the nasal cavity and also form the upper part of the air passages. The maxilla and the mandible, which is the upper and lower jaw, provide ridges in which teeth are embedded. The upper jaw, the maxilla, is fused with the cranium and therefore immovable. However, the lower jaw, which is the mandible, is movable. The hard plate, which is bony, and the soft palate, which is cartilaginous, separate the buccal cavity from the nasal cavity. The lower jaw is movable due to its articulation with the cranium, namely the temporal bone. The zygomatic arch, which is formed from parts of the zygomatic bone and the temporal bone, provides surface for the muscular attachment for moving the lower jaw. There are a few processes which are basically protrusions of the skull present. So the lower jaw, which is the mandible, contains two processes. The condyloid process, which articulates with the temporal bone to form the temporal mandibular joint and facilitates the moving of the lower jaw, and also the coronoid process, which gives attachment to muscles and the ligaments. At the base of the skull, occipital condyles, there is only one pair, are present on the two occipital bones to form a hinge joint with the atlas vertebrae. The temporal bone contains three processes: the zygomatic process, which forms part of the zygomatic arch, the mastoid process and the styloid process, out of which the latter two are generally there to provide surfaces for muscle attachments. Right, so now let's talk about the second part of the axial skeleton, which is the vertebral column. The vertebral column is a strong, flexible rod consisting of 26 linearly arranged bones, which are basically consisted of 24 separate vertebrae, which extend downwards starting from the occipital bone of the skull, and also the sacrum, which is formed by 5 fused vertebrae, and the coccyx, which is formed by 4 small fused vertebrae. The vertebral column is generally divided into four distinct and different regions. The cervical spine, which is formed by 7 vertebrae in the neck, the thoracic spine, which is formed by the next 12 vertebrae, the lumbar spine, which is formed by the remaining 5 vertebrae, and the sacrum and the coccyx, which are generally considered as a single region. There are 4 curvatures in the human vertebral column, which mainly involve in maintaining an erect posture. These curvatures are categorized into 2 main types: primary and secondary. So primary curvatures are basically the only types of curvatures formed in the fetus, which are present at birth. However, when secondary curvatures are formed during the development of a child, the primary curvature is retained only in the thoracic and sacral regions. The primary curvatures are generally concave anteriorly. Secondary curvatures are generally formed after birth, and the 2 secondary curvatures present in humans are present in the cervical and the lumbar regions. So the first secondary curvature to be formed is the cervical curvature, and this develops at about 3 months of birth. Thus, the child can then hold its head upright. Once the lumbar curvature develops when the child is around 7 to 8 months, the child can then hold its entire body upright. Secondary curvatures are thus generally convex anteriorly. So now let's talk about the structure of a typical vertebra, right? A typical vertebra consists of 2 parts: the body and the vertebral arch. The body is generally the largest, the broadest, and the flattened part of the vertebrae. The flattened part of each vertebra, which is the body, articulates with the corresponding surface of the adjacent vertebra so that the vertebrae are stacked together in the vertebral column. However, they are not in direct contact, and instead there is a tough part of cartilage called the invertebral disc, which is present between the two vertebrae. The size of the body of the vertebra increases downwards as you go downwards through the vertebral column, and this is because as you go downwards you have to support increasingly more body weight. So this is the general structure of a typical vertebra, and as you can see, you have a flattened surface, the body. You have the vertebral arch, which consists of what is called a vertebral foramen, which provides space for the spinal cord. You have processes, which consists of the transverse process, the spinous process, and also superior articulatory processes and also inferior articulatory processes. However, you can't see inferior articulatory processes in this diagram because this is a top view of the typical vertebra. So you can see that the vertebral arch encloses the vertebral foramen, which provides passages for the spinal cord, and also the processes such as the transverse process and the spinous process, which arise from this vertebral arch, provide surfaces for muscle attachment. So the first type of vertebra is called the cervical vertebra. There are 7 cervical vertebrae in the vertebral column, and these vertebrae are generally the smallest vertebra. The body is smaller when compared to other vertebrae. This structure shows you the typical cervical vertebra, and as you can see, there is a general small body. The transverse process is also small, and the transverse process consists of foramen on each side, which provides passage for the vertebral artery. You can see a special unique feature to cervical vertebrae as well in the spinous process, where the spinous process of the cervical vertebra is biped. So the first cervical vertebra is known as the atlas cervical vertebra. This is the bone on which the skull rests through the occipital joints present on either side of the foramen magnum. So this is the general structure of the atlas vertebra, and as you can see, the atlas vertebra lacks a body and is generally ring shaped, and it also lacks a spinous process. It has 2 relatively short transverse processes, which, like all cervical vertebrae, have transverse foramen for the vertebral artery. The atlas contains 2 flattened facets which articulate with the occipital bone of the skull through the condylite joints, thus permitting nodding movements. It also has a facet for articulation with the odontoid process of the next cervical vertebra, which is called the axis cervical vertebra. The vertebral foramen of this vertebra is relatively larger to provide passage of the larger anterior part of the spinal cord, which connects with the medulla oblongata of the brain. So the second cervical vertebra, which is the axis cervical vertebra, is generally the vertebra which is responsible for permitting of side to side movements of the head. So this is the structure of the axis vertebra, and as you can see, as usual, there is a bifid spinous process which is unique to cervical vertebra. There are transverse processes with transverse foramen for the vertebral artery. There is a body, and the unique feature here is the presence of a odontoid process which articulates with the atlas vertebra above, and thus this is the process which allows the head to pivot, which means to turn from side to side. So the second type of vertebra is called the thoracic vertebra, and there are 12 thoracic vertebra in the human skeleton. These vertebrae are generally larger than the cervical vertebra, as in this region you have to support more body weight. Thus, The body and the transverse process of the thoracic vertebra have facets for articulation with the ribs, and this is a general structure of the thoracic vertebra. So you can see on the body and the transverse process you have facets for articulation with the ribs, and also as usual you have the rest of the spinous process, which in this case is in bifid, the body, the vertebral foramen, and also superior and inferior articulatory processes. The third type of vertebra is the lumbar vertebra, and this is the vertebra that is considered to be the typical vertebra in the human skeleton, right? So there are 5 lumbar vertebrae, which are the largest of the vertebra because they had to support the most body weight of the upper body. The body is thus the body of the vertebra is thus comparatively larger than the other vertebra types to support this increasingly high body weight. There are large spinous processes in the lumbar vertebra which are present for the attachment of the muscles of the lower back. The fourth region is the sacrum and the coccyx. So the sacrum is a triangular shaped large bone consisting of 5 fused rudimentary vertebrae, and it has a concave anterior surface. The upper part of the sacrum articulates with the 5th lumbar vertebra, and it also articulates with the pelvic girdle on either side. The inferior tip articulates with the coccyx, and as in this diagram you can see a general anterior view of the sacrum and the coccyx. A unique feature to the sacrum is the presence of foramina for the passage of nerves laterally on either side of the sacrum. The coccyx, as you can see, is a small triangular bone consisting of 4 fused terminal vertebrae. So there are a few functions of the human vertebral column. The first is that it helps to maintain erect posture through the primary and secondary curvatures. It also supports the skull through the first atlas cervical vertebra, and also gives attachment to ribs and girdles through the thoracic vertebra. It provides protection for the spinal cord through the vertebrae and vertebral discs, which act as shock absorbers. The vertebral foramens provide spaces for spinal nerves and blood vessels and also lymph vessels. It allows flexibility in body movements. The third part of the axial skeleton is called the sternum, and this is a long flat bone that forms the anterior part of the thoracic cage, which is made up of the sternum, the ribs, and the thoracic vertebra. The upper section of the sternum is known as the manubrium, and the manubrium articulates with the clavicles in the pectoral girdles and also the first 2 pairs of ribs. The middle part of the sternum is called the body, and the body gives attachment to the rest of the ribs. The xiphoid process is what is known as the tip of the sternum, and this gives attachments to the diaphragm and the muscles of the anterior abdominal wall. The sternum also provides protection to the organs and blood vessels that lie behind it, which is the heart and lungs, from physical damage. And also the red bone marrow present in the sternum is one of the main sites for the production of blood cells. The fourth part of the axial skeleton is the ribs. There are 12 ribs which form the lateral walls of the thoracic cage. Ribs are generally elongated and curved and articulate posteriorly with the thoracic vertebra of the vertebral column. So you can remember in the thoracic vertebra there are articulatory facets on the transverse and the body, on the transverse process and the body, which articulate with the ribs in this way. There are 7 pairs of true ribs which articulate with the sternum anteriorly and directly. 3 pairs, however, articulate with the sternum indirectly through costal cartilages, and the lowest 2 pairs do not join the sternum and therefore are called floating ribs. The head of the rib articulates with the vertebral bodies, and the facets of tubercles of the ribs articulate with the transverse process of the vertebrae. Between each rib, intercostal muscles are present, which move the rib cage during breathing, thus increasing the volume of the thoracic cage and the lungs. The first rib is firmly fixed to the sternum and the first thoracic vertebra, and thus doesn't move during breathing. Thus, this causes to pull the entire rib cage upwards and towards the first ribs as the intercostal muscles contract during inspiration, and therefore increases the volume of the thoracic cage and subsequently the lungs. The ribs and sternum also provide protection to the organs such as the lungs and heart in the thoracic cavity. The contribution of the human axial skeleton to maintaining the upright posture of the human body is very vital, right? So the first way that it does this is the presence of the two primary and the two secondary curvatures in the vertebral column. More importantly, the development of the two secondary curvatures in the vertebral column, which contribute to maintaining erect posture. The size of the vertebra, which becomes larger towards the end of the vertebral column, is especially important, as this enables them to support the increasing weight of the upper body. The sacral vertebra, which are fused to form the triangular shaped sacrum, to support the weight of the vertebral column and also the internal organs of the body, is also very vital. The arrangement of the occipital condyles and the foramen magnum, which permits proper balancing of the skull on the vertebral column through the atlas cervical vertebra, also helps to maintain the upright posture of the human body. Right, so next we'll talk about the appendicular skeleton. Firstly, about the girdles of the appendicular skeleton. There are two main girdles present, the pectoral girdle and the pelvic girdle. The upper limb forms joints with the trunk through articulation with the pectoral girdle. The pectoral girdle connects the upper limb with the axial skeleton, and it consists of two scapulae, which are shoulder blades, and two clavicles, which are collarbones on either side of the axial skeleton. The lower limb forms a joint with the trunk at the pelvic girdle, and the pelvic girdle is also associated with the sacrum and is formed by two hip bones. So this is the right clavicle of the pectoral girdle, and as you can see, there is a facet for the articulation with the scapula, which is the shoulder blade, and also a facet for articulation with the sternum. This is the right scapula, which is a shoulder blade, and there is again a facet for articulation with the clavicle and also the glenoid cavity, about which we will talk about further into the video. So there are 30 bones which make up the upper limb, which is your hand, right? So they are the humerus, the radius, the ulna, 8 carpal bones, 5 metacarpal bones, and also 14 phalanges, right? And you can see them in this diagram: the humerus, the radius, the ulna, the carpal bones, the metacarpal bones, and the phalanges. So the carpal bones and the metacarpal bones are what make up your palm, and the phalanges are what make up your fingers. The joints of the upper limb. The head of the humerus, which is the bone of the upper arm, forms what is called an incomplete ball and socket joint, which is the shoulder joint, in the glenoid cavity of the scapula of the pectoral girdle. The distal end, which is the further end of the humerus, has two articular surfaces through which the radius and the ulna articulate with the humerus at the elbow joint. The radius and the ulna also articulate with the carpals at the wrist joint. and they also articulate with each other at the proximal and distal radio-ulnar joints, which are present again on both sides, as said by the words proximal and distal. A fibrous joint connects the bones along their shafts, which stabilize their association and maintain their relative position despite forces applied on the elbow or wrist. So no matter which way you twist your elbow or your wrists, because of this fibrous joint, these shafts are stable and therefore their relative positions are maintained. The elbow joint acts as a hinge joint. The carpal bones, which are arranged in two rows, the proximal row and the distal row, are closely fitted together, so there is limited amount of movement between them. So you generally can't move the two rows of your carpal bones, which is your palm. The proximal row bones are associated with the wrist joints, and the distal row bones form joints with the metacarpal bones. The proximal ends of the metacarpal bones in the palm articulate with the carpal bones, and their distal ends articulate with the phalanges, which form the fingers. So the human upper limb has certain adaptations for basically movement through a wide range, and we'll see what these adaptations are. So the structure of the upper limb is mainly adapted for grasping, weightlifting, and movement over a wide range. The incomplete ball socket joint, which is the joint which is made up by your humerus and the glenoid cavity of the pectoral girdle, permits a vast range of movements such as flexion, extension, adduction, abduction, rotation, and also circumduction. The elbow joint, which acts as a hinge joint, permits flexion and extension of the forearm. The wrist joint arrangement between the radius, the ulna, and also the carpal bones allows pronation, which is palm up, supination, which is palm down, and the wrist joint can also be flexed, extended, abducted, and adducted. The joints between metacarpal and phalanges allow movement of the fingers and permit what is called the power grip. So when you grasp something, this is what is called the power grip, and it is you are able to do that because of the joints between the metacarpal and the phalanges. The fingers may be flexed, extended, adducted, abducted, and circumducted. The first finger, which is your thumb, is more flexible than the others, and this is because the joint at the base of the thumb between a specific carpal bone and the metacarpal bone allows more mobility to the thumb than the other fingers. This leads what is called the opposable nature of the thumb, which is found in basically all primates, which permits the thumb to move perpendicular to the other fingers. This articulation then permits what is called the precision grip, which is unique to man and also primates. So the precision grip is when you are opening, say, the cap of a bottle. The grip that you use there is called the precision grip. Now let's move on to the lower limb. So the lower limb consists of 30 bones in general. The femur, which is your thigh bone, the tibia, which is the shin bone, the fibula, the patella, which is the kneecap, 7 tarsal bones, which are the ankle bones, 5 metatarsal bones, which are the bones of the foot, and 14 phalanges, which are the toe bones. And you can see these bones in this structure, right? So this is the femur, the patella, which is the kneecap, the tibia, the fibula, tarsal bones, metatarsal bones, and finally the phalanges. The joints of the lower limb are as such. So the femur is the longest, the heaviest, and also the strongest bone of the body. The head of the femur forms the hip joint, which is what is known as a ball and socket joint, with the acetubulum of the hip bone of the pelvic girdle. The lower end of the femur articulates with the tibia and the patella to form what is called the knee joint. The tibia is the medial of the two bones, which is the tibia is the medial of the femur and the patella. All lower ends of both the tibia and the fibula articulate with a specific tarsal bone to form what is called the ankle joint. So the lower limb is also adapted for specific things such as erect posture, bearing of body weight, walking, and also strength. So now this hip joint is very sturdy and powerful as it bears all the body weight when standing. So the hip joint is what makes the pelvic girdle. The lower limb can be extended, it can be flexed, adducted, abducted, rotated, and also circumducted at the hip joint. Possible movements at the knee joint are flexion, extension, and a rotatory movement that locks the joint when it is fully extended, and this occurs due to the presence of the kneecap, which is the patella. When knee joint is locked, it is possible to stand upright for a long period of time. The femur transmits the weight of the body through bones below the knee to the foot. The ankle joint allows rising in tiptoe and lifting toes towards the calf. So in both ways, right? The arrangement of the bones in the foot, supported by associated ligaments and muscles, gives the sole of the foot an arch or a curved shape. And there are generally two types of arches present in the foot, right? So these two types are longitudinal arches, which are curves running from the heel to toe, and a transverse arch, which is the curve running across the foot. And in this diagram you can see this, right? So this is a transverse arch which runs across the foot, and longitudinal arches on either side of the foot, which runs from the heel to the toe. In the upright position, these arches of the foot are very important in distributing the weight of the body evenly, whether stationary or moving. This thus brings us to the end of part 2 of the skeletal system, done by the Kampa Medical Students Association. If you have learned something, please do not forget to like, subscribe, and continue to follow us for more videos. And also, if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to ask us through the comment section. This is Melaka signing off. Thank you.